Steele was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1962, the lone boy among 5 older sisters, an arrangement that all but guaranteed that he grow up feeling a bit like an alien in his own home. He called himself the little brother from hell, not necessarily because he was a troublemaker, but because he had to fight to be seen, or to be heard, or to really carve out any space that was truly his. But the Steele household definitely was a lively one. Conversations overlapping, laughter spilling into arguments, the constant push and pull of sibling dynamics. But Peter, even as a kid, always seemed to be looking for something deeper, some confirmation that his presence was more than just another mouth to feed. He developed a strange little ritual, hiding under beds, sometimes for hours, waiting for that perfect moment. And the game was simple. The second an unsuspecting family member walked past, he'd shoot out a hand and grab their ankle, desperate for a reaction, for some kind of moment where their attention was entirely on him. He wasn't trying to be cruel. It wasn't some sadistic prank. He was just the youngest kid, and he had to keep proving that he existed. He always wanted that connection, or to be considered a part of the gang, so to speak. And Peter had said that his parents were too wrapped up in their own heads to notice. And he carried that loneliness with him, tucked somewhere deep in his chest, right alongside the strange flutter in his heart, an irregular rhythm he swore that had been there since birth. And Peter Steele picked up a guitar when he was young, but it didn't take him long to realize that 6 strings were just not for him. It was the bass that really called out to him. Something heavier, something with more depth. It wasn't just an instrument switch, it was a declaration. A 6'8" kid with hands like wrecking balls needed something that could match his presence, something that rumbled through the floorboards and made itself known. And even as a teen, music wasn't just a hobby, it was a way out, a way forward. Peter bounced between bands, dipping his toes into different sounds, searching for something that felt like home. None of it quite stuck, but it didn't matter. He was building that scaffold to what would eventually become his own voice. Peter Steele's school years were spent under the grip of Catholicism, 8 long years inside a system that demanded obedience and order, and the weight of religious structure really pressed down on him, feeding both his fascination and resentment at the same time. Between the rituals, the stark contrast of sin and salvation, the omnipresent guilt, whatever it was, it buried itself deep inside his psyche, simmering there, just waiting to be resurrected later in the music. And he absorbed it all, letting it twist and turn inside at him until faith became something dark, something wrapped in questions and contradictions. By the time he hit 19, the tension between where he'd been and where he wanted to go reached a total breaking point. One day, unceremoniously, he hauled a mattress up from his parents' basement and kicked it down the stairs. He didn't want to just leave, he wanted to make sure there was no way back. The thud of the mattress hitting the floor below was the sound of a door slamming shut. A life left behind. Peter Steele's first stomp into the metal scene came with Carnivore, a band that was about as subtle as a boot to the teeth. And Peter Steele had always gravitated toward the heavier end of the spectrum, and with Carnivore, he found a vehicle for his most unapologetically brutal stuff. It wasn't just the music, though the music was pretty hardcore, and oftentimes it actually made Slayer sound polite by comparison. Carnivore was definitely not about precision or accessibility. It was about pushing things to the absolute limit, finding the line and then obliterating it. Steele's lyrics were pretty provocative, and a lot of people would get really freaked out by them. The band was a middle finger set to music, and Peter, towering and deadpan, totally relished the role. The controversy wasn't an accident. He loved the idea of making people uncomfortable, forcing them to react, whether getting them to laugh or just be totally outraged or just confuse the living hell out of them. But Carnivore was never built to last. It burned fast and loud, and by the time the dust settled, Steele was ready for something else. And that something else took shape in the early 90s when he reconnected with his childhood friends Josh Silver, Kenny Hickey, Sal Abrusco. These were guys he had grown up with, who had seen him through his early years of adolescent rebellion, his towering frustrations, and yes, all the Catholic stuff too. And they started piecing together a new band, one that carried the weight and intensity of Carnivore, but wasn't so focused on sheer aggression. The goal here wasn't about pummeling the audience into submission. It was about atmosphere, depth, finding something darker, something slower and heavier, and definitely a hell of a lot more deliberate. And that project would become Typo Negative. Their first major release, Slow, Deep, and Hard, dropped in 1991. And if Carnivore had been an open invitation to a street fight, Slow, Deep, and Hard was a slow descent into a very specific kind of madness. It was ugly in such a beautiful way. Felt like a man dragging his own demons into the light just to beat them to death in front of a crowd. Sonically, it was just a weird animal. Part doom, metal dirge, part thrash-fueled tantrum, part miserable diary entry read aloud, with, of course, a freshly spun roulette round to the temple. The influence of Sabbath was obvious, but it wasn't the groove-heavy Sabbath of the 70s. It was the Volume 4 and Master of Reality Sabbath, the suffocating, drugged-out gloom that felt like it might collapse under its own weight. But Slow, Deep, and Hard was still carrying the residue of Carnivore, not just in its abrasive thrash elements, but in Steele's still developing voice as a lyricist. There's no softening anything. It was filled with seething bitterness, betrayal, black humor that just wasn't exactly concerned with being subtle. But if there was one thing Peter Steele would learn in his career, it was that people don't always understand satire. And when you play with fire, you don't get to decide who gets burned. The album's humor, dark, biting, laced with irony, was taken at face value by a lot of listeners, and not in the way that Steele intended. Songs like Der Untermensch, which was meant to be a scathing critique of deadbeat drug addicts, ended up getting misinterpreted as straight-up bigotry. He was trying to play the villain, to be exaggerated and cruel and ridiculous in a way that it circled back to being absurd, but a significant chunk of the audience totally missed the punchline. And Steele quickly realized that the Carnivore approach, going full throttle into the most offensive, provocative thing possible, wasn't going to work the same way in this new group. Typo Negative was not Carnivore. It was going to be something else, more layered, refined. But that realization didn't happen overnight. It started to creep in after the backlash to Slow, Deep, and Hard. Steele didn't suddenly become restrained or politically correct. He was still Peter Steele, after all. But he started to think more about how his words were landing. It wasn't about shocking people for the sake of it. He had something else brewing, going much more for the personal, dark, melodic elements. Before Bloody Kisses changed everything, Typo Negative was still clawing its way through the underground, operating more like a dark comedy troupe that happened to play doom metal than a serious up-and-coming band. And touring in those early days was less about cementing their reputation as musicians, more about seeing how far they could push an audience before they either walked out or started throwing things. Steele, already towering and corpse-like, had this habit of making things worse. Long, meandering, in-between song monologues, deadpan insults aimed directly at the crowd. He had this stage presence that was equal parts funeral procession and Andy Kaufman performance art, and audiences just did not know what the hell to do with it. At their worst, they were getting booed off stage or getting beer bottles hurled in their direction. But at best, they were making people deeply uncomfortable in a way that kept them watching. And that was the real goal, making sure that nobody could look away. A famous early tour in support of Slow, Deep, and Hard saw Steele actively taunting crowds, delivering bitter monologues about heartbreak, betrayal, only to cut himself off to call some guy in the front row a human cum stain, before launching into another 10-minute doom dirge. Peter was becoming a master at manipulating an audience's emotions, dangling them over the edge before pulling them back. Take this one for example. In one show, after a particularly rough night of heckling, he deliberately slowed a song down to a near stop, playing every note 1 per 20 seconds, dragging the entire set into this nightmarish exercise in patience. The audience was pissed. Some of them walked out. Others stayed just to see how long he could keep this thing going. But Steele found it hilarious. And when they weren't actively provoking their own fans, the band was living like a gang of wayward undertakers let loose out on the world. Their tours were riddled with cheap motels, all-night drinking sessions, and Peter Steele's increasingly unhinged experiments in staged banter. He would sit backstage before a set, scribbling down fake set lists with titles like I Want to F Your Mom or Masturbating at Your Funeral, just to see the band's reaction when he deadpanned that they would just be debuting this new track that night. He would get drunk and start telling crowds that they were the worst audience he had ever seen, and then smirk as half the room booed and the other half cheered even louder. Not sure if they were in on the joke or the target of it. So then they come out with The Origin of the Feces, a live album that wasn't live. It was an inside joke that went so far inside, it came back out as a functioning album. A true middle finger to expectations disguised as a record label appeasement tactic.
There are two things that people should never look into, and that is what goes into the workings of record companies and what goes into the making of sausages.
Whatever you want to call it, it's peak Typo Negative. So the band was given money to record this live album, and instead they spent the money partying. When the label inevitably asked for the recording, the band, shockingly, did not have one. So what does any good band do? Well, they went into the studio, faked an entire concert, and turned that in instead. Rather than try to hide the deception, they leaned into it with all the grace of a drunk stumbling off of a bar stool. They added fake crowd noise, staged arguments with an imaginary audience, even had the show interrupted by a fake bomb threat because, well, authenticity. And this was all a nod to that first European tour, which in true typo fashion was a complete train wreck that nearly broke the band, or at least broke Peter Steele's patience with extensive touring. The "You Suck" chant on the album, that actually happened. The bomb threat, that also happened. The overall general sense of chaos, not a stretch whatsoever. It was a nice compromise to give the label a quote-unquote live album while making fun of the entire concept of a live album, basically taking the absolute piss out of it. At its core, the origin of the feces is just a slow, deep, and hard with a different coat of paint. Same songs, different titles, a little more noise, a little more punk attitude. The crossover thrash elements from the debut, totally toned down. Instead, they just upped the doom and gothic metal elements. The sense of humor, fully weaponized. Take, for instance, the song that was titled "Unsuccessfully Coping with the Natural Beauty of Infidelity" became "I Know You're Fucking Someone Else," in case the first title was probably a bit too subtle. Meanwhile, Gravity took the place of Gravitational Constant. 6.67 times 10 to the negative 8 per cubic centimeter per gram per second squared. Brings back bad memories. But maybe they realized that nobody wanted to scream that at a show. Kill You Tonight and Pain replaced Zero Tolerance and Prelude to Agony. New names, same bad attitude. The only brand new song, Are You Afraid, was an intro they used to play live. And by new, I mean it was just Gravity's warm-up routine. But it was a preview of where they were going. More gothic, brooding, more in the realm of bloody kisses. Less rage, more deep down, dirty depression. And then you had the covers, because Typo Negative covering songs was never just a cover. It was an exercise in taking something familiar and making it completely unrecognizable. They took Hey Joe, turned it into Hey Pete, rewrote the lyrics to make it about Steele himself, and suddenly it wasn't a cover anymore. Just a weird gothic murder ballad. And then there's the Paranoid cover, which was put on the reissue, where they somehow made Black Sabbath sound yet even more like Black Sabbath. Slow, doomy, slips Iron Man's riff in there, just because they could. And because subtlety was never a part of the plan, P.T. Barnum was actually credited as the producer. And then there's the cover. We're talking the original cover. If you haven't seen it, don't. It is a close-up of Peter Steele's anus. That's it. That's the joke. It even featured a scratch and sniff, because why stop at visual horror when you can assault multiple senses at once? And eventually, cooler heads prevailed. Somebody realized that selling an album with an actual butthole on the front might not be the best idea. So the reissue went with a nice, classy, medieval painting instead. But let's be real, the damage was already done. And the album title itself, in case nobody got it, was a play on Darwin's Origin of the Species, but this one was called Origin of the Feces. At the time, the album was really just a placeholder, a joke, a way to buy time before Bloody Kisses. But in hindsight, this is where Typo Negative really found their identity. The debut was an introduction to the music, and Origin of the Feces was an introduction to their personality. And if one didn't get it, well, that was their problem. And once the joke wears off, there is something real underneath, because for all of the absurdity, it actually does feel a bit like a live album. The interludes, the space between songs, the ridiculous banter, it's all there, just manufactured in a way that makes it feel more real than some actual live records in a lot of ways. And then Bloody Kisses happened. Released in 1993, it wasn't just another album. It was a turning point, a sonic obituary for the band that had existed up to that moment, and the grand gothic resurrection of something new. Those first notes of Christian Woman set the tone. Atmospheric, creeping, deadly, sensual, and more melodic than anything they had ever done before. Gone were the reckless thrash injections and the abrasively sarcastic delivery. Instead, Bloody Kisses leaned into slow burn intensity and that smirking embrace of the band's doomed sound. And Peter Steele definitely had not lost his sense of humor. Songs like Black Number 1 were proof of that, but now it was sharpened, much more refined. The band stopped trying to make the audience hate them and started making them a bit more complicit in the joke, and it actually worked. Suddenly, Typo Negative wasn't just a band that made a handful of people uncomfortable in dingy clubs. They were selling records, getting radio play, appearing on Beavis and Butthead, and becoming an honest-to-God phenomenon.
I'm like in a video. want to, Hey, leave her alone. Leave her alone. Fart knocker.
The Bloody Kisses tour was a different animal altogether. For the first time, they were playing to people who actually wanted to be there, who knew the words, and who showed up in full gothic regalia, ready to worship at the altar of doom. Peter Steele and his element played the part to perfection. Dressed more like a vampire, long-haul trucker, he swayed behind the bass like a reanimated corpse, his deep voice hypnotic and his humor sharper than ever. But just because they were suddenly legitimate didn't mean that they cleaned up their act. On the road, Typo Negative still functioned like a roaming pack of nihilistic pranksters with too much time on their hands. Peter Steele, in particular, found a new level of commitment to the bit. At one stop, he convinced an interviewer that he was clinically dead, playing it so straight that they actually called a producer to confirm if it was even possible to do an interview with a corpse. At another show, when asked by a promoter if they needed anything, Steele reportedly requested a coffin for emotional support, and then made a grand show of lying in it backstage between sets. Then there was a night in Detroit where they played so loud and so slow that half the stage crew started nodding off. Peter Steele, ever the sadist, noticed and deliberately extended the song Can't Lose You by another 8 minutes just to see if he could put an entire venue into a trance. In Chicago, he bet the rest of the band that he could get the entire audience to do a synchronized slow headbang, then spent 5 minutes conducting them like some undead orchestra leader until the whole place was moving in eerie unison. The larger venues, the bigger crowds, the unexpected mainstream recognition, it could have changed them, but it didn't. Typo Negative was still a band that would rather make you uncomfortable than make you dance. And even when Bloody Kisses started climbing the charts, Steele remained Steele. He still heckled his own audience. He still introduced himself as the Green Man or Satan's bass player, depending on his mood. He still took genuine pleasure in making people second-guess whether they were supposed to be laughing or crying. And by the end of the tour, Bloody Kisses had gone platinum, something that nobody, including the band, had ever expected. From a band that was too weird, too slow, or sarcastic for mainstream success, here they were, no longer underground. Steele, for all his self-deprecating humor and nihilistic tendencies, had somehow managed to become a sex symbol in the goth scene, which is a role he played with equal parts amusement and reluctance. He would talk about it in interviews like it was some kind of cosmic accident, like the world had collectively lost a bet and how he had to deal with the consequences.
My next guest is the lead singer of the popular alternative band Typo Negative. Welcome, Peter Steele. You happy to be here?
I'm less miserable.
You have women that are throwing themselves at you every night you do a concert. Are you up there playing, women are dancing, going crazy, throwing themselves at you, trying to meet you backstage? What do you think of these women?
I'm here to pay my phone bill. And,
Take them up on it? Do you sleep with some of them?
I'm going to have to take the Fifth Amendment on that.
But under all that sarcasm, there was a shift happening. The band wasn't just a niche act anymore, and there was something bittersweet about it. Steele had always dug the idea of being an outsider, cultivating this image of a reluctant, miserable frontman who would collapse under the weight of his own cynicism at any moment. And success, in a strange way, was the one thing he hadn't prepared for. The Bloody Kisses tour had proven that they could command massive audiences, and that the world wanted what they were putting out there. But what happened when the outsider band suddenly had a seat at the table? That question would loom over everything that came next. By the time Bloody Kisses had cemented Typo Negative as something more than a joke at the edge of the metal scene, Peter Steele started retreating inward. Success, for all its perks, didn't sit easily with him. He had spent years building up this image, and now that everybody was buying it, it put on this whole other level of pressure, where all of a sudden everything just mattered. But that weird reality made its way onto their next record, October Rust, released in 1996. And that was like a fever dream in comparison to its predecessor. If Bloody Kisses was the sound of a man testing his own limits, how far he could push, or offend, or how slow he could drag a song down into oblivion, then October Rust was the sound of him giving in, pretty much embracing the inevitable weight of it all. This was the record where Typo fully leaned into their gothic tendencies, peeling away at the remaining thrash metal crust to reveal something lush, atmospheric, even beautiful. It opened with a joke, 2 minutes of dead silence, followed by the band sarcastically welcoming the listener. But once the music kicked in, it was undeniable. This was Typo Negative at their most indulgent, their most hypnotic. The guitars rang out like cathedral bells. The songs stretched out into these massive, sweeping dirges, moving at the pace of slow decay. Steele's voice had never sounded richer, deeper, more like a funeral procession echoing down an empty street. But what really set October Rust apart was its sincerity. There are those traces of Steele's signature gallows humor, but this was an album drenched in yearning. Here, though, he let himself fully sink into it. Songs like Love You to Death and Be My Druidess weren't cynical. They were haunted, almost devotional in their obsession. Even the heavier tracks like Wolf Moon carried the sense of desperate need to connect before everything inevitably fell apart. October Rust wasn't about shocking anybody. It was about surrender, and it worked. Fans totally ate it up. The same people who had once come to Typo Negative shows expecting carnage and cruelty were now swaying in unison, mouthing the words to songs that sounded like love letters written from inside of a crypt. And this album went gold. The tours were bigger than ever, and Peter Steele, for all his natural inclination to self-destruct, found himself in the role of an unwilling rock star. But if October Rust was Steele leaning into the fantasy of it all, World Coming Down, released in '99, was him violently clawing his way back out. If the previous album had been a slow-motion fall into some dark, seductive abyss, World Coming Down was the inevitable crash at the bottom. This was a record made by a man unraveling in real time. Steele had always flirted with themes of addiction, death, and loss, but here he wasn't playing a character. He wasn't filtering it through exaggerated personas or layered irony. This was Steele fully exposed, bleeding out in slow motion. And the album didn't have an entry point. There was no black number one here. No radio-friendly anthem to balance out the weight of it all. Instead, World Coming Down played like a funeral march from start to finish. Every track dragging the listener deeper into Steele's personal apocalypse. Songs like Everyone I Love Is Dead and Everything Dies were exactly what they sounded like. The title track itself was a suffocating 8-minute descent into nihilism, a song that didn't build toward anything so much as it collapsed under its own weight. Even the interludes, short, unsettling pieces titled Sinus, Liver, and Lung, were direct nods to the way Steele was poisoning himself, chronicling the slow-motion breakdown of his own body. This was an album that didn't want to be loved. It wasn't about drawing in new fans or keeping up appearances. It was a record that practically dared you to turn it off. But that's the thing about Typo Negative. Their audience had always been drawn to the band's willingness to say the things no one else would say, and to turn pain and misery into something grand, something larger than life. And World Coming Down was the culmination of that. An album that felt like it was being played from the other side of the grave. The irony, of course, was that this album, one of their bleakest, most uncommercial efforts, still managed to keep that momentum going. Even as Steele seemed to be actively trying to tear all this down, the fans just stayed. It didn't need the hits. It wasn't about accessibility. It was just so real. And Typo Negative wasn't just a band anymore. They were a lifeline for people who saw themselves in that darkness. By the time Life Is Killing Me dropped in 2003, Peter Steele had long settled into his role as metal's most brooding frontman of all time. And Steele, for all his cynicism, knew exactly how to keep the audience there. Life Is Killing Me was, in many ways, more of a return to form. Though form for Typo Negative really had always been a shifting target. If World Coming Down was the sound of a man on the verge of total collapse, Life Is Killing Me was Steele clawing his way back, smirking, bruised, but still standing. And it was the band's most biting, sarcastic album in years, brimming with frustration, exhaustion, and a very specific kind of humor that only Steele could pull off. Musically, the album leaned back into some of the faster, more immediate elements that hadn't been as present since Bloody Kisses. But the doom and gloom were still there, wrapped up in Steele's usual preoccupations: death, addiction, failed relationships, and the cruel absurdity of life itself. Tracks like I Don't Want to Be Me were anthems, rare moments of something resembling accessibility, if you could call Steele's deadpan, self-loathing lyrics accessible. But beneath the sarcasm, there was still a raw nerve exposed. Anesthesia dug into the wreckage of a toxic relationship. How Could She rattled off a list of fictional heartbreaks involving TV sitcom women. And The Dream Is Dead closed the album with kind of a bleak finality that only Typo Negative could make sound beautiful. But Life Is Killing Me felt like Steele trying to get his footing again. But then the album Dead Again, released in 2007, was something else entirely. It was the sound of a man who had been through hell, crawled out the other side, and was now looking back at the wreckage with a mix of bitterness and reluctant wisdom. By this point, Typo Negative was no longer a band struggling for recognition. They had been around for nearly 2 decades, had built up a cult following that felt less like a fan base and more like a secret society, and Steele had cemented himself as one of metal's most fascinating figures. But he was also a man who had been through too much, and Dead Again reflected that. The album was a strange beast, both a continuation of what came before and a departure in its own right. It was more raw, looser, and at times almost punk-like in its aggression, something that felt intentional, as if Steele was tired of everything moving at a funeral's pace and just wanted to bash out some songs before everything else collapsed again. The title track was an immediate gut punch, a grim reflection on relapse and self-destruction, while Trippin' a Blind Man veered into scathing social commentary, a rare moment of outward-directed anger from a band that had always been more about internal battles. But Peter Steele was still Peter Steele, and even at his most blunt, he couldn't resist moments of strange beauty. September Sun was pure gothic grandeur, stretching out over 8 minutes like a slow-motion descent into nostalgia and regret. These three things was massive, sprawling, packed with religious imagery and a sense of impending doom that felt less theatrical and more real than anything the band had done in years. And then there was She Burned Me Down, a song that somehow managed to combine seething anger, smirking irony, and genuine heartbreak pretty much all at once. A perfect encapsulation of everything Typo Negative had always been. And even as Dead Again took on a rougher, more desperate edge than its predecessors, it was clear that Steele hadn't lost his ability to balance contradictions. He could be funny and tragic in the same breath, menacing one moment and more vulnerable on the next. The music still carried that massive lumbering weight, but now it felt more immediate. Like Steele wasn't just reflecting on the past anymore, he was actually living the consequences. By the time Dead Again was released, Typo Negative had evolved into something more than just a group. They were total legends, a strange and singular force in metal that didn't belong to any one category. They weren't just goth or doom or thrash or even strictly metal. They were Typo Negative, something that couldn't be replicated, only experienced. And at the center of it all was Steele, the reluctant frontman, the self-deprecating giant who had spent decades turning his own misery into something grand and unforgettable. And in the days before his death, Peter Steele was not the same man that he had been in his most chaotic years. The downward spiral, the addictions, reckless self-destruction, he had managed to pull himself out of all of that. He was clean, sober, and thinking ahead for the first time in years, talking about the future with something like actual genuine excitement. He had plans. He was looking to move near Staten Island, settling into a quieter space where he could focus on writing the follow-up to Dead Again, an album that had already hinted at a return to form. Peter Steele was not done yet. There was more music in him, definitely a lot more to say. But whatever momentum he had built up came to a halt when he got sick. At first it was nothing serious, just the flu, something that he could shake off. But it lingered, and then it got worse. He spent days stuck in bed, his body betraying him in ways that he didn't yet understand. On April 14th, 2010, the first report surfaced. Rumors at first, scattered, surreal, the kind of thing you would expect from a bad joke on an internet message board. But this wasn't one of Steele's pranks, though it almost felt like it could be. The truth came in waves, slowly at first, and then all at once. Initial reports suggested an aortic aneurysm, but the real cause was something even more cruel. Sepsis, the result of an infection caused by diverticulitis, had taken him down in the end. Something small, internal, that no one had seen coming. The news hit with an eerie silence at first, disbelief, refusal to process the weight of it. His sister made the call to his bandmates. There was no long explanation or lead-up, just the blunt finality of it. We lost Peter. And the words hung in the air like something impossible, something that nobody could really fully register. Johnny Kelly was hit with it like a gut punch. He heard it first through a voicemail and then again in a phone call, his brain unable to catch up to the reality of what was being said. "How come you didn't call me?" he blurted out, his own disbelief turning into some kind of knee-jerk protest, as if hearing it from a different voice might make it untrue. And then, as the weight of it settled, someone finally put words to the absurdity of it. Steele had pulled one last prank. His entire career had been laced with black humor, with the kind of wit that made you laugh while wondering if you were supposed to. And now, in some twisted, poetic way, he left on his own terms, with a joke that nobody could possibly one-up. Typo Negative, the band that had always blurred the line between tragedy and comedy, between beauty and decay, had died with him. It wasn't just the loss of a frontman, it was the loss of an entire entity. a force that couldn't exist without the man at its center. Peter Steele's absence left a hole in the metal world that no one else could fill, a void that still lingers, dark and untouchable. But the thing is, Peter Steele never had any kind of patience for the grandiose titles people tried to slap on him. Icon of Gloom, Dark Prince of something something. It all sounded ridiculous to him, like a bad marketing gimmick. He didn't see himself as some towering gothic deity, just some dude from Brooklyn who happened to write miserable songs and crack jokes about them in the same breath. And that refusal to take himself too seriously only made him more fascinating. On stage, he was impossible to ignore. A 6'8" specter looming behind his bass, growling out songs that could sound like funeral hymns or cruel jokes depending on how you looked at them. But then, in between songs, he'd turn around and puncture the entire mood with some absurd one-liner, catching the audience totally off guard. He had a way of making people laugh in the middle of their own despair, and balancing doom with the kind of humor that made everything feel less suffocating. And that contradiction defined his entire approach to music. He could go from writing about death, addiction, and heartbreak to poking fun at his own self-loathing in the same album, sometimes in the same song. It wasn't just heavy, it was human, completely unfiltered. And whether he meant to or not, Peter Steele became a benchmark. Bands that came after him couldn't help but pull from that strange, intoxicating blend of crushing weight and dark humor, whether they admitted it or not. After his death, people struggled to put words to the absence. Peter Steele had spent so much time leaning into the gloom, but the truth was, he was the light in it. Friends and bandmates described him as a missing ray of sunshine, proof that no matter how many bands tried to fill the space he left behind, there was no real replacement. Even now, musicians still gather to pay tribute, keeping his influence alive. Peter Steele left a void, and nothing else has quite filled it.
And as Mark Twain put it, rumors of my death have been highly exaggerated.